She was just the maid, until the ocean changed everything. The salt water stung Elena's eyes as she stumbled along the rocky shore. Her uniform soaked through, her carefully braided hair coming undone in the wind. Behind her, the Martinez estate rose like a fortress against the twilight sky, its windows glowing with warmth she'd never truly been allowed to feel. She hadn't meant to run. She hadn't meant to let. Mrs. Martinez's words cut so deep that her hands shook as she polished the silver. Hadn't meant to drop the antique picture frame that shattered across the marble floor. But when Catalina had rushed into the room, when their eyes had met over the broken glass, when Mrs. Martinez had seen the way her daughter looked at the help, everything Elena had been holding inside for 2 years came crashing down with the force of a tidal wave. Elena Torres had always been invisible. That was the first rule of being good at her job. Move through rooms like a whisper, anticipate needs before they're spoken, exist in the spaces between conversations without ever becoming part of them. She'd learned this at 16, when her mother died and left her with 3 younger siblings to feed. Learned it in the houses of the wealthy along the Chilean coast where girls like her cleaned toilets and scrubbed floors and pretended not to. Hear the things said when people thought they weren't really there. By 23, she'd perfected the art of disappearing. She could fold herself so small that she barely took up space in the world, could make her presence so quiet that families forgot she was human at all. The Martinez family had hired her 2 years ago to maintain their summer home in Viña del Mar, and she'd been grateful for the steady work, grateful for the money that kept her siblings in school, grateful even for the loneliness that came with being perpetually unseen. But Catalina Martinez had seen her. From the very beginning, from that first summer when she'd arrived home from university in the States, she'd looked at Elena like she was more than just the girl who washed her sheets and cleaned her bathroom. Catalina would ask questions while Elena worked, real questions about her life and her dreams and whether she'd ever wanted to do something besides clean houses. She'd insist Elena take breaks, would leave books on her bed with notes inside suggesting chapters she might enjoy, would thank her by name every single time Elena brought her coffee or tidied her room. At first, Elena had been terrified of this attention, certain it would get her fired, certain that Mrs. Martinez would see how her daughter treated the maid and decide Elena was overstepping boundaries she hadn't even approached. But Catalina was relentless in her kindness, persistent in her refusal to let Elena remain invisible. And slowly, terrifyingly, Elena had begun to look forward to those moments when Catalina was home. The truth had crept up on both of them like the tide. It started with lingering glances that lasted a heartbeat too long, with fingers that brushed when Elena handed Catalina her morning tea, with conversations that stretched past midnight, when Elena should have been in her small room off the kitchen but instead found herself on the back terrace listening to Catalina talk about art history and her frustrations with her controlling mother and how suffocating it felt to have your entire life planned out before you'd even lived it. Catalina would confess things in the darkness, her voice soft and vulnerable, about the boyfriend her mother approved of who bored her to tears, about the pressure to marry well and maintain the family's social standing, about how she sometimes felt like she was drowning in expectations and couldn't find the surface. And Elena, who'd never allowed herself to want anything beyond survival, found herself wanting to reach across the space between them and promise that she understood, that she saw Catalina just as clearly as Catalina saw her. This past summer had been different. Catalina had returned from Barcelona changed somehow, more certain of herself, more willing to challenge her mother's edicts. She'd started painting again, something she'd given up years ago, and she'd asked Elena to sit for her. Those afternoons in the sunlit studio had been torture and heaven intertwined. Hours of Catalina studying every detail of Elena's face while Elena tried to keep her expression neutral, tried not to let her feelings show in the set of her mouth or the warmth in her eyes. But Catalina painted what she saw, and the portrait that emerged was not of a maid or a servant or someone invisible. It was of a woman with depth and beauty and an ocean of unspoken longing in her gaze. When Elena had finally seen the finished painting, she'd understood that Catalina knew. Catalina had always known. They'd kissed 3 weeks ago in the garden after everyone else had gone to bed. Elena had been cutting roses for the breakfast table, and Catalina had appeared like something from a dream, wearing a white nightgown that caught the moonlight. Neither of them had spoken. Catalina had simply reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind Elena's ear, and Elena had leaned into her touch like a flower turning toward the sun. And then Catalina's lips were on hers and the world had tilted on its axis. They'd kissed until Elena's back was pressed against the garden wall, until her hands were tangled in Catalina's hair, until they were both breathless and trembling with the weight of everything they'd been holding back. Afterward, Catalina had whispered that she didn't care about the difference in their circumstances, that what she felt was real and worth fighting for, that she wanted to find a way to be together openly. Elena had wanted to believe her. God, how she'd wanted to believe that love could be enough to bridge the canyon between their worlds. But Elena had learned long ago that wanting something didn't make it possible. She'd seen the way Mrs. Martinez looked at her, seen the calculation in those cold eyes that measured Elena's worth by how well she scrubbed grout and how little space she took up in their lives. She'd heard the conversations about Catalina's future, about suitable marriages and family, legacy and maintaining their position in society. Elena was a body that cleaned, a pair of hands that served, a ghost that moved through their home. She was never going to be someone Mrs. Martinez would accept at her daughter's side. And Elena had responsibilities too, siblings who depended on the money she sent home every month, a family that would suffer if she lost this job. Loving Catalina felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that jumping meant losing everything stable she'd ever had. For 3 weeks they'd stolen moments, secret kisses in the laundry room, whispered conversations when Elena brought breakfast to Catalina's room, hands held under the dinner table where no one could see. Catalina grew bolder, more convinced that they could find a way, that love was worth the risk. She talked about them leaving together, moving to Buenos Aires or Mexico City where no one knew them, starting fresh where they could be themselves. She painted picture after picture of Elena, each one more intimate than the last, each one a declaration of feelings that terrified Elena, even as they filled her with desperate hope. Elena had started to believe that was her mistake. She'd started to imagine a life where she could be more than the help, where she could wake up next to Catalina without fear, where she could love openly without shame. Today had shattered that fragile dream. Mrs. Martinez had discovered one of the paintings, had found Catalina's portfolio, hidden in the studio, and seen every canvas filled with Elena's face, Elena's body, Elena's eyes looking at the painter with unmistakable love. The screaming had echoed through the house. Mrs. Martinez had called Elena into the sitting room where Catalina sat crying, surrounded by her paintings like evidence at a trial. The older woman's voice had been ice as she'd accused Elena of manipulation, of taking advantage of her position, of corrupting her daughter with inappropriate attention. Elena had stood there mute, unable to defend herself, unable to explain that she'd fought against these feelings with everything she had, that Catalina had been the one to pursue, to insist, to refuse to let what they felt remain unspoken. It hadn't mattered. Mrs. Martinez had already decided the truth, had already cast Elena as the predator and her daughter as the victim. Catalina had tried to interrupt, had stood up and declared that she loved Elena, that what they had was real and mutual and nothing her mother said could change that. But Mrs. Martinez had turned on her daughter with fury, had threatened to cut her off completely, to ensure she never saw Elena again, to destroy any chance either of them. Had it happiness if Catalina didn't stop this foolishness immediately. Elena had seen the moment Catalina's resolve began to crack, had watched the fear creep into her eyes as she realized what choosing Elena would cost. And Elena, who'd spent her entire life making herself small to avoid causing trouble, had done what she always did. She'd apologized. She'd told Mrs. Martinez it was her fault, that she'd misread Catalina's kindness, that she would leave immediately and never contact the family again. She'd watched Catalina's face crumple, had ignored her cries of protest as Elena walked out of the room with whatever dignity she could salvage. She'd meant to pack her things and disappear, but her feet had carried her to the ocean instead, to the beach below the estate where she and Catalina had walked so many evenings, where they'd talked about everything and nothing while the waves crashed against the rocks. Elena sank onto the sand and let herself cry for The first time since her mother's funeral, let out all the grief and anger and heartbreak she'd been holding in. She cried for the life she'd never have, for the love she'd have to let go, for the girl who'd seen her when everyone else looked through her. She cried until her throat was raw, and her chest ached, and the tide had come in far enough to soak her shoes. "You're a terrible liar. You know." Catalina's voice cut through the sound of the waves. Elena looked up to find her standing a few feet away, still in the clothes she'd been wearing during the confrontation, her eyes red and swollen. "You told my mother you misread my feelings." That was a lie. Elena couldn't find words. She watched as Catalina moved closer, as she sank down onto the sand beside her without any concern for her expensive dress. They sat in silence for a long moment, both staring out at the darkening ocean. Finally, Catalina spoke again, her voice steadier now. "I've been living my whole life the way other people wanted me to. Studying what my mother chose, dating who she approved of, planning a future that looked perfect on paper and felt empty inside. I thought that was just how life worked, that you sacrificed what you wanted for what was expected. And then I met you and you were so real. Elena. So genuinely yourself even when you were trying to be invisible. You made me want to be brave. Your mother will destroy you if you choose this," Elena whispered. "She'll take everything. She'll take her money and her approval," Catalina corrected. "But she can't take who I am. And I finally know who that is." She reached for Elena's hand, lacing their fingers together. "I'm someone who loves you. I'm someone who's tired of hiding. I'm someone who would rather have a difficult life with you than an easy life, pretending to be something I'm not." Elena turned to look at her, searching those familiar eyes for doubt and finding only determination. "I have nothing to offer you. No money, no future, no safety. Just me, and that's not enough." "It's everything," Catalina said fiercely. "You are everything, and we'll figure out the rest. We'll work, we'll struggle. We'll probably fail at 100 things before we get it right, but we'll do it together, and that makes it worth it." She brought Elena's hand to her lips, pressing a kiss against her knuckles. "Unless you don't feel the same way, unless you don't want this. If this story is touching your heart, if you believe in love that breaks barriers and courage that defies expectations, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Your support helps share these stories of hope and reminds others that they're not alone in their struggles." Elena looked at this extraordinary woman who was offering her everything despite the cost, who was choosing love over comfort and authenticity over approval. She thought about her siblings, about the life she'd planned, about all the practical reasons why this was impossible. And then she thought about waking up every morning knowing she'd let fear win, knowing she'd let the only person who'd ever really seen her walk away because the world said they didn't fit. She thought about being invisible again, folding herself small, living half a life because a full one seemed too risky. "I'm terrified," Elena admitted, "but I want this more than I've ever wanted anything." Catalina's smile was like sunrise. She stood and pulled Elena to her feet, and together they walked back toward the house. Not to pack Elena's things in shame, but to gather them in defiance. They would leave the Martinez estate together. Catalina would work for the first time in her life, would learn what it meant to earn rather than inherit. Elena would stop hiding, would let herself be seen not just by Catalina but by the world. They would struggle and stumble and probably question their choice 100 times, but they would do it together, and that would make all the difference. The ocean had always represented freedom to Elena, its vastness a reminder of possibilities beyond the narrow confines of her life. Now, with Catalina's hand in hers, she understood that freedom wasn't about escaping to something bigger. It was about being brave enough to choose love even when it was hard, about refusing to make yourself smaller so others could feel more comfortable, about believing that you deserved to be seen and loved exactly as you were. Before we close this chapter, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below sharing a moment when you chose courage over comfort, when you refused to hide who you were despite the cost. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. 6 months later, in a tiny apartment in Santiago, where they both worked and barely scraped by, Catalina would paint Elena again. But this time, the woman in the portrait wouldn't be trying to make herself invisible. She would be standing tall, eyes bright with joy, hand reaching out toward the viewer, as if inviting them to step into a life lived, fully and without apology. And when people asked Catalina about her muse, she would say with pride that she was painting the woman she loved, the woman who'd taught her that some people were worth risking everything for, the woman who'd been just the maid until the ocean changed everything, until love gave them both the courage to dive into unknown waters and discover that together they could swim